On the evening of September 8, 1934, residents of the coastal town of Asbury Park, New Jersey, were startled to see this incredible spectacle: an ocean liner smoldering from stem to stern, beaching itself on their shore right in front of their town. The catastrophic fire aboard the SS Morro Castle claimed 135 lives and commanded front-page headlines all over America. Indeed, no marine disaster that occurred between the two world wars was more prominent or more well known to Americans than the Morro Castle, which is kind of incredible considering how relatively obscure the event is today. What caused the fire, and how did it get so badly out of control? The usual culprits in fire at sea stories, bad decisions, poor safety protocols, rotten luck, they're here too, but it turns out that there's a lot more to the Morro Castle story than that. For example, just a few hours before the fire broke out, the captain of the Morro Castle died mysteriously in his cabin. Was that connected to the disaster? There was also a complex political backdrop to the ship's story, involving gun smugglers and Cuban revolutionaries. Is that relevant to how this ship wound up on the beach at Asbury Park? Indeed, the more you peel back the layers of this event, the more complex it becomes, and the fewer definite answers we have. In this video, I'll try to answer the deceptively straightforward question: what happened to the Morro Castle, and why? This is truly an amazing story in the annals of 20th century nautical history. Hi, Sean here, and thanks for joining me for more nautical and ship history. Whether this is your first time or whether you've seen my videos before, welcome. The story of the Morro Castle is a unique and fascinating one. As a ship, she was nothing particularly special, a mid-sized ocean liner built for a specific mission. But the events of September 1934 are pretty unique in 20th century ocean liner history. This is the kind of story that really needs to have a big budget Hollywood movie made about it, so somebody needs to get on that, by the way. There's no way that I can cover the Morro Castle disaster comprehensively in one relatively short video. I'm going to try to hit the highlights, but there are many smaller details that I'm just not going to be able to get to. One of the things I try to do in my ship videos is to give you a sense of the historical context in which these events take place. That's why before we even get to the subject of the Morro Castle herself, I think we have to start by talking about Cuba, the ship's last port of call before the fire. Both long before and long after the period where the disaster occurred, 1934, Cuba was a colony of the United States in all but name. Presidents from Thomas Jefferson on down coveted the island, and many presumed it would eventually be absorbed by the U.S. President James Polk tried to buy it for $100 million, no dice. The Spanish-American War of 1898, which arose in part out of the American relationship to Cuba, saw the island become nominally independent, but that was largely a fig leaf. Americans controlled nearly 2/3 of the island's main industry, which was sugar production, and the city of Havana in particular was sort of an even wilder tropical version of Las Vegas, full of decadent thrills like casinos, brothels, and sex clubs. This made it an appealing destination for American vacationers, and rich soil for businesses both legal and illegal. If you've ever seen the movie The Godfather Part 2, the plot of that film deals heavily with this kind of thing. Additionally, tens of thousands of Cubans, or Americans of Cuban descent, lived in the United States, especially in New York and other large cities. Wherever there were significant economic and cultural ties between two countries, and a lot of people going back and forth between them, there was a market opportunity for passenger shipping companies to rake in that sweet ocean liner cash. One company that took advantage of this was the New York and Cuba Mail Steamship Company, also known as the Ward Line, which had been transporting people between the United States and Cuba since the 1850s. The Ward Line got a low-interest loan from the federal government to subsidize the building of two new medium-sized passenger liners. They were the Morro Castle and the Oriente, constructed at Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Newport News, Virginia. The Morro Castle's keel was laid 10 months before the Wall Street crash of 1929. Incidentally, she was named after the fortress Morro Castle, also called El Morro, built by the Spanish at the entrance to Havana Harbor in 1589. The fortress was a common sight for travelers who arrived in Havana by sea. Morro Castle was 508 feet long, 70 feet wide, and was technically a turbo-electric liner, the same engine type as the French line's Normandy would eventually use. She could make 20 knots, a pretty respectable speed for a liner designed for a market other than transatlantic. Morro Castle could make a trip between New York and Havana in just 59 hours, which she proved on her maiden voyage in August 1930. At this time, prohibition was still in effect in the United States, and the Ward liners offered a sweetener for Cuba-bound vacationers. You could get a drink on board legally. Indeed, the Morro Castle's voyages were often all-day, all-night drinking parties. Finding passengers completely drunk in the sitting rooms or stumbling around on deck was not an uncommon occurrence. This booze cruise aspect of her business was one reason why Morro Castle turned a profit, even in the depths of the Great Depression, though her bookings remained quite high even after Prohibition was repealed in 1933. Just as there was a dark side to the relationship between Cuba and the United States, there were some unsavory and dangerous things about the Morro Castle. As you might imagine, on an island being constantly exploited by colonial powers, Cuba was a hotbed of revolts and revolutionaries, and its internal politics were very unstable. Some of the revolutionary groups fighting against the U.S.-backed government were communist in their political orientation. To fight the endless brushfire wars against these rebels, American government and private interests supplied a lot of guns to the Cuban government. Morro Castle was one of the main conduits of clandestine military supplies bound for Cuba. Crates of gunpowder, machine gun ammunition, small arms, bullets, shells, and cartridges were often carried in her hold on Havana-bound voyages, listed on the ship's manifest as sporting goods. Some sport. Cuban rebels were well aware of how American arms got into the country, and it made the Morro Castle a potential target. The dark side of life aboard the Morro Castle extended to realms unrelated to Cuban politics. Labor conditions on board were problematic. The crew was overworked, underpaid, and surly. Their accommodations were squalid and intolerable, and the food was particularly bad. That detail kept coming up in a lot of stuff I read about the ship. Strife between labor and management was particularly fierce in America in the mid-1930s, and no more so than in the merchant marine business. In short, although the ship was profitable for her owners and a lot of boozy fun for passengers, she had a lot of problems. There were several incidents aboard the Morro Castle that last summer before the disaster, some of which might be relevant to what happened later. Speaking of bad food, on July 29, 1934, the captain, Robert Wilmot, was served a meal in his cabin that made him so sick he told the ship's doctor he thought someone was trying to poison him. About a month earlier, one of the ship's radio operators, George Alanya, tried to organize a strike among the crew. He didn't succeed, but there was some chicanery among the radio room staff, particularly when one of them, Stanley Fairson, started receiving anonymous letters warning him that the Ward line was investigating him for speaking out about bad working conditions right after that failed strike attempt. Spooked by these letters, Fairson quit the Morro Castle in August 1934. It appears that the letters were written by one of the other radio operators, a man named George White Rogers. Rogers was a shady character. He had a rap sheet for various crimes, co-workers and former employers thought he was untrustworthy, and he'd been suspected, though not proven, to have committed arson against the Wireless Eggert Company in New York in 1929. For reasons that will become obvious soon enough, I'm fascinated by the idea that the captain thought someone was trying to kill him. There's no direct evidence of a murder plot, but Captain Wilmot does, on the other hand, seem to have gone into an unhealthy decline about this time. He stopped appearing at dinner with the passengers, preferring to take meals in his cabin, and he communicated with his officers and gave orders mostly by telephone. He drank only bottled water, suggesting that he was afraid of poisoning. Unreasonable paranoia, or was there something or someone really to be afraid of? We can't know. Oh, one more thing happened. I almost forgot about it. On August 27, 1934, just 11 days before the disaster, a fire broke out in the Morro Castle's hold, dangerously close to one of the cargoes of the quote-unquote sporting goods that they were carrying to Cuba. The fire was extinguished quickly because Morro Castle had a safety feature, a fire suppression system combined with a sophisticated smoke detection network, which, if a fire was detected in the hold, would smother it by pumping pressurized carbon dioxide into the affected compartment. This fire of August 27th was probably arson. Captain Wilmot believed it was those communist insurgents, and he seems to have thought labor agitators in the radio room were among them. He became even more paranoid, and decisions were made to try to sack some of the radio guys after the next voyage. Now, I'm oversimplifying this. It's a really tangled story, but that is the gist of what was going on at the time that the Morro Castle left Havana on September 5, 1934, for her 174th and last voyage. There were three noteworthy things about the Morro Castle's final voyage that began that day. First, in addition to being almost full up with passengers, the ship was carrying a cargo of salted hides from Havana, which raised a huge stink. In order to avoid the stench filtering into the passenger areas, Captain Wilmot ordered that sophisticated smoke detection and fire control system to be switched off. Second, right before sailing time, George White Rogers received word that this trip was to be his last. Radio men were not technically employees of the Warren Line. They were employees of the Radio Marine Corporation of America, which subcontracted with the Warren Line to supply radio operators to their ships. But the Radio Marine Corporation had just concluded an investigation into Rogers' background and found out about his criminal activity and his long history of problems. The third thing that happened was something no one could control. Beginning on the afternoon of Friday, September 6th, a nor'easter began blowing up off the southeastern coast. The ship was headed right into it with increasingly high winds. Because of the rolling waves, the parties aboard the ship were less raucous than usual, with many passengers down from seasickness. That day, the captain was also not feeling well. He complained of tiredness and a backache and decided, as usual, not to go to dinner with the passengers, though he did briefly attend the traditional farewell cocktail party usually held on the last night of the voyage. He went back to his cabin and ordered dinner. At 7:30 p.m., the ship's second officer, William Worms, went to the captain's cabin to deliver the latest report on the storm. He seemed fine then, and Worms went back to the bridge. 18 minutes later, Worms returned to the captain's cabin with another update, but this time no one answered. Opening the door, the first officer found Captain Robert Wilmot slumped over the side of the bathtub, dead. The ship's doctor examined the captain briefly and said he died of heart failure. First Officer William Worms, now field promoted to captain, went to the bridge to handle the ship during the storm. At 2:00 a.m., Morro Castle was 30 miles south of the Ambrose Lightship, the traditional marker of the lower boundary of New York Harbor. 45 minutes later, 4 passengers who were still up, drinking in one of the bars, smelled the first hint of smoke. At about the same time, the night watchman reported to Captain Worms that he smelled smoke coming out of a duct near the first-class writing room on B deck. Some testimony after the disaster spoke of drunk passengers chucking lit cigarettes into wastebaskets in the writing room. The fire, however it started, spread fast. As you recall, the fire suppression system had been switched off. However, that only covered the cargo hold. But for several other reasons, Morro Castle was helpless in the face of the blaze. The now deceased captain had also halted the procedure of having regular fire and lifeboat drills for the passengers, and hose stations had been shut down after a slip-and-fall accident resulted in a lawsuit against the passenger line. Bad call, Ripley. Fire equipment was never properly maintained. What was more, on the very day of the disaster, there was a fuel blockage in a line supplying one of the ship's boilers, which couldn't be fixed at sea, causing the engineer to shut the boiler down. In the event of a fire, it was the boilers and their associated lines that were supposed to supply the water to fight it. To make matters worse, the ship was headed directly into the wind. As the winds of the nor'easter picked up, they had the effect of a bellows in a fireplace, amplifying and fanning the fire throughout the upper parts of the ship. By 3:10 a.m., Morro Castle was a floating inferno. The fire burned through numerous cables supplying electrical power and hydraulic pressure to key systems, which meant that not only was the ship now unsteerable, but panicked passengers were now running around in the dark, or worse, trapped in cabins or corridors that were pitch black and filling with smoke. People began clustering at the ship's stern, and many, unable to get to the lifeboats, started jumping into the ocean. Before the power to the radio was cut, Morro Castle had time to send only one distress signal. That was sent by radio man George Rogers. But even through the wind and driving rain, ships distantly in view began to notice the strange fiery glow of a vessel in distress on the horizon. Nevertheless, by the time the first rescue ship, the Andrea F. Luckenbach, arrived, the majority of Morro Castle's victims had already perished. If you're enjoying this video on the Morro Castle, what would help me the most to make more videos of this type is for you to watch something else on my channel right after this video finishes. I've done some interesting stuff recently on the second Mauretania from 1938 and the original aircraft carrier Enterprise. I also have a book out. It's fiction. It's an international crime thriller called In Deadly Mirrors Available on Amazon. The Kindle version is only 99 cents, and reflecting my love of ships and nautical stuff, part of it does take place on a ship. Link to that is in the description. Now let's finish the story of the Morro Castle. The rescue was haphazard. While some of the Morro Castle's lifeboats were useless, having buckled during the intense fire, a few managed to get away. Neighboring ships and the Coast Guard did what they could to take in boats and fish survivors out of the water. A few hardy people swam to shore, but corpses from the ship continued to wash up all over the Jersey shore for days afterward. The acting captain, William Worms, was the last living person to leave the ship. As the ship still smoldered, the Coast Guard tried to tow the scorched hulk of the Morro Castle into New York. They had to cut the ship's anchor chain away before this could be done, and even then the tow failed. The tow cable eventually snapped, and the ship began drifting free in the still heavy seas. The waves washed her directly toward the beaches of Asbury Park. There, at about 7 p.m. on the evening of September 8, 1934, Morro Castle grounded on the beach, only a few hundred yards from the Asbury Park Convention Center. There was a radio station, WCAP, located in the convention hall. An announcer named Tom Burley was on air at the time and essentially live-streamed the grounding of the Morro Castle, which shuddered to a halt only 300 feet from where he sat in the studio. Spectators had been arriving all day to watch the spectacle, but the final crash of the smoking ship onto the beach was the climax of the show. A local resident said to the mayor of Asbury Park, who was standing there watching, quote, "This is the biggest thing that's ever happened to us. They're going to come from all over to see it, raise a city flag on her to stake our claim." The chance of winds and waves had brought the ship to the beach, but what happened after that is an interesting microcosm of Depression-era America. In 1934, the United States was still sunk deeply into the worldwide economic crash. Asbury Park was the sort of place that was suffering more than most. It seems ghoulish that the first thought of some residents was how to profit from the disaster. But if you know the context, it becomes a lot easier to understand. The beachside community of Asbury Park became a going concern in the Gilded Age, largely because of the railroad. It was a day-trip vacation destination for wealthy New Yorkers and Philadelphians who could easily get there by train in a couple of hours, and their increased affluence in the decades after the Civil War meant there was money to spend in a place like this. The usual infrastructure of East Coast beach resorts followed: big wooden hotels in Gothic and wedding cake styles, boardwalks, amusements, roller coasters, dance halls, and taverns. There was also a seamy underside to this sort of thing: traveling carnivals populated by shady characters, pickpockets, petty crime, and lots of government corruption, especially during Prohibition, where a lot of illegal booze imported into the U.S. came by sea. But fueled by businesses both legal and illegal, by the 1920s, Asbury Park was booming. The convention hall where the Morro Castle shuddered to a halt was built in 1928 and brought even more visitors down to the water's edge. The party came to a crashing halt when the Great Depression hit. By the early 1930s, Asbury Park was something of a sad and depressed place, still a tourist beach town, but with an air of decay about it. Then the Morro Castle drifted into view, its decks still smoldering, and the somewhat desperate residents suddenly saw dollar signs, an early example of what's now called disaster tourism. Within hours of the beaching of the ship, people had put up signs on roads leading to Asbury Park, reading 2 miles to the Morro Castle wreck and "Welcome to Asbury Park, home of the Morro Castle." Cafes, restaurants, and hot dog stands were doing brisk business. But the biggest racket was the ship herself. A Coast Guard official and Asbury Park's city engineer strung ropes from the convention hall to the Morro Castle and established a breeches buoy, which is basically a large bucket on a zip line. For $5, you could ride the buoy out to the hulk of the ship and look around for yourself. A gas mask, still needed because of smoke and fumes, cost another $5. A flashlight, another $1. You might think that looting was a problem. It wasn't. There was nothing left aboard Morro Castle to steal. The fire had burned so intensely and so completely that it simply incinerated everything: carpets, paneling, furniture, flooring, and anything left behind by the passengers fleeing the ship. What had also been incinerated was any hard evidence of how or why the fire started, or what had happened aboard her before the disaster. Asbury Park's fire chief and a couple of his men went over to the ship the night it beached, searching for the body of the captain. They found Wilmot's remains and brought him back in a couple of shoe boxes. The coroner did try to autopsy the ashes, looking for signs of poison, but as you might imagine, it was inconclusive. The Morro Castle provided a temporary boom to the depression-stricken town of Asbury Park, but it didn't last. The burned-out hulk remained off the beach for several months. In March 1935, she was finally floated off the sandbar and towed to Gravesend Bay, New York. Eventually, she wound up in a scrapyard in Baltimore, Maryland, where she was broken up. A legend arose that some of the scrap metal from the Morro Castle was sold abroad, particularly to Japan, the number one buyer of scrap metal from the United States at that time. The legend held that metal from the ship went into building Japanese warships, some of the same ones that later struck the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. There's no way to know if that story is true. So the big question remains, what caused the fire? Officially, despite numerous inquiries by various authorities, they never found out. Any physical evidence was incinerated in the fire itself. However, many believed at the time, and still do, that the fire was deliberately set, and that the most likely suspect was George White Rogers, the radio man, briefly feted as a hero in the press after the disaster for having sent the ship's one SOS call. Then there was the story of the drunk passengers flicking cigarettes into wastebaskets in the writing room. The press ran with various hysterical speculations about communist saboteurs. Some ship experts have suggested faulty wiring or an overheating of one of the ship's smokestacks, which was very near the writing room. We can never know for sure. There have been several books written on the Morro Castle disaster. Two in particular were helpful sources for this video. Shipwreck, The Strange Fate of the Morro Castle by Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witz, published in 1972, and a more recent one, When the Dancing Stopped by Brian Hicks from 2006. Of those two books, although the more recent one by Hicks is better sourced, I prefer the older book, which was written when many of the witnesses and participants were still alive. Both books, incidentally, conclude that the fire was arson and that George Rogers did it. The evidence against Rogers, though circumstantial, is fairly compelling. He may have used an incendiary device hidden in a fountain pen to ignite the fire, incidentally the same method used to burn down the wireless Eggert Company in 1929. Rogers was mentally disturbed. In the 1950s, he was convicted of a grisly double murder, and he died in prison in 1958. In my own personal opinion, I agree that the evidence points pretty strongly to him having done it. But if Rogers did torch the Morro Castle, did he also kill Captain Robert Wilmot? I'm reluctant to conclude anything based solely on the notion that it can't be a coincidence that he died hours before the fire. It can't be a coincidence is faulty reasoning and the stuff of conspiracy theories. If that alone was the only reason to connect the captain's death to the fire, I'd say that no, I'm not convinced. However, the captain did think that someone was trying to kill him, and he did apparently believe that an attempt had been made on his life by poisoning earlier that summer. His health was poor, granted. He seems to have had sort of a paranoid personality, and it's not at all clear how George Rogers, a radio man, could have gotten to the galley to poison the captain's food not once but twice. And the motive isn't exactly clear either, although the captain clearly did have several enemies on the ship. It's at least possible that Rogers, or perhaps somebody else, did poison the captain, and then started the fire later to destroy the evidence. Or it's possible that Captain Wilmot was murdered by somebody else, and Rogers then took advantage of the chaos on the bridge to start the fire without having had anything to do with his death. I hate to keep saying we'll never know for sure, but exactly what happened aboard the Morro Castle on that last night will probably be unresolved for all time. I've recently done some other videos on nautical history topics, both involving military and civilian ships. My latest one is on the demise of the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you'll look me up again soon for another bit of nautical history. Smooth sailing and safe travels.